procedural things for us before we start in terms of the start of our formal meeting. So welcome everybody. And first item I need to do amongst the panel members is to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of December.
I'll move.
I'll second.
All in favour? Aye, carried. Thank you. Right, that was pretty simple and painless. We'll now move on to agenda item number 2, which is an application for resource consent RC 210142, Douglas Developments Limited, Terrace. This is a properly convened meeting of the hearings panel called for the purpose of hearing submissions in relation to a resource application to undertake a 17-lot subdivision in a rural resource area. I'd ask the Minutes Secretary to report on proceedings to date.
All statutory requirements under Section 95 of the Resource Management Act have been complied with. Report of the planning consultant has been circulated to the address for services and the submissions received have been identified in the report.
Thanks, Nicole. The following procedure will be followed for the hearing. The panel of officers may ask questions. Council's officers or its consultant shall put any questions through the chair, and the chair shall be deemed to be the person asking the questions. The applicant or the applicant's representative shall make submissions and present evidence. The submitters or their representatives shall then make submissions and present evidence. The planning consultant shall make then make their submission. The applicant shall have the right to reply, but shall not be permitted to again traverse the evidence nor raise new evidence. So we'll just get underway. Before we proceed with the hearing, I'd ask that all parties appearing identify themselves. Just before we start off with that, just to reinforce what Nicole said in terms of what microphones are on and what cameras are on as we work through the process. That'll just help us a fair bit. Thank you. And I'm going to just checking what I was going to do. Bridget or Brody is who's leading the charge for you guys?
It's me, Commissioner. So good morning, Bridget Irving, Council for Douglas Developments. You can see I've got my relatively new colleague Gus just joining me today to observe the hearing. And so with any luck, you'll stop seeing me sometime in the future and you'll see him.
Very good. Well, you make sure you train them well then.
Absolutely. And we've got obviously Brodie Costello and Lloyd Morris representing Douglas Developments online also.
Cool, thank you very much. And it might be easier for me to go through the, oops, hang on, sorry, my pen just decided to break, so I'll throw that away and get a new one. That'll work. It's good when you're sitting in your office with all the stuff at your disposal. There. And my camera says that I can see Chris White. Right, yeah, Chris White. Chris, welcome.
Correct. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, that's fine. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, that's green light land. Thank you.
That's right, thank you. I've got the name Hudson Dimmick. You on the line, on the call?
Good morning. Yes, I am.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And representing Molyneux Farm Limited, Graham Todd.
Graham, I don't think he'll be here today. Commissioner, his client has withdrawn the submission and filed an effective party approval.
Cool, they have two. Thank you. That's all right. That's handy. One less to go through. And Chris Goddard. Chris, I've seen you there, I think.
Yes, present.
Yeah, it's not quite like a schoolyard, but yeah, thank you. Right, more importantly, is there anybody on this call who's expecting to make any submission or presentation to this particular application that I haven't checked off with?
Yes, through you, Chair. ORC is here as well, so it's Anita Dorr. I do have a commitment, but I've got my colleague Warren Hanley who will sit through the hearing as well if you've got any other questions.
Cool, thanks, Anita. Just add that to my list. Right, thank you. Anybody else that I've missed? Doesn't sound that way. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll get underway with, first of all, I'll move that the report of the planning consultant be taken as read. Someone like to second that, please?
I'll second.
Thank you, Stephen. All in favour?
Aye.
Much. And I'll pass over to you, Ms. Irving, to take us through. Now, thank you for all the evidence that's been pre-circulated. And yes, we have read the application. Yes, we have read the evidence. And Teams is a little bit harder than doing it in person, but it'll be really useful if you can take us through your evidence and point out the key points, and then the panel may have some questions. So we'll go from there. But certainly there's no need, and I'd prefer not if we wasn't read verbatim, but equally got to make sure that the panel is aware of what the issues are from both the applicant and the submitters. So Ms. Irving, over to you.
Thank you, sir. So I've circulated to Nicole this morning just some legal submissions, which I'll take you through. And obviously we've pre-filed evidence from Mr. Morris and Mr. Costello. And the legal submissions deal obviously with the legal framework that you're working with, and I'll barrel through those parts reasonably quickly because you're well familiar with them, and then tackle some of the matters raised, particularly in the evidence filed on behalf of the Otago Regional Council. So obviously the application is framed as a farm park type development, which is a relatively unique concept within Central Otago. Since the evidence itself was filed, there have been a couple of changes made following discussions with Molyneux Farm Limited. Now those changes are essentially confirmation around the boundary planting with the Molyneux Farm land and its ongoing maintenance and the conditions and consent notice conditions that were proposed in Mr. Costello's evidence in relation to that, and also amendments to the scheme plan which increased the setback from the Molyneux Farm land from 25 metres to 50 metres for the rural living allotments on that side of the property. So Mr. Costello, I think, filed updated scheme plans late last week. And if you've got any particular questions about those, you can direct those to him. So obviously the application is for a non-complying activity, and so it's necessary for the proposal to pass through the section 104D gateway. In my submissions, I've provided you with an outline of the 104D tests, and I won't take you through those. I would just note that when you are undertaking your assessment under section 104D, it's an assessment from the policy gateway point of view against the district plan provisions only. The provisions of the higher order documents, regional policy statements and national policy statements are not part of the section 104D assessment. So I'll move on to obviously section 104, which is the evaluative exercise that you need to undertake. And I set out at paragraph 25 the various parts of that. Permitted baseline, I think we agree with Ms. Lindsay's assessment of what the permitted baseline is, and there's relatively little in the permitted baseline that is of direct relevance to the application. Turning to the environment, obviously your assessment of effects under section 104(1)(a) has to be undertaken against the environment or existing environment within which the activity will take place. That environment encompasses what we see on the ground today, but also the future state of the environment as it might be altered by permitted activities or the implementation of existing resource consents that are likely to be exercised. In my submission, the application and the evidence filed in support have described the environment within which the application is made. When you are considering the future environment, you need to have a genuine attempt at envisaging what that will be, but equally you can't stray too far from what can reasonably be predicted. In this instance, the feature of particular relevant to determining the existing environment is the consent obtained by Greenlight for subdivision on the adjacent land. That consent, including the roading upgrades and landscaping required by it, are in my submission part of the environment against which this application needs to be assessed. Turning to the key, I suppose, effects matters in contention, the first being rural character, amenity and visual effects. And the conclusion of the applicant's experts in the Section 42A report are consistent, that being that effects on rural character, amenity and visual effects will be minor. The planning evidence presented for the Otago Regional Council reaches a different conclusion. And I do note the ORC haven't produced any expert landscape evidence that rebuts the findings of the Align report filed by the applicant. As I discussed previously, context is important. And while the application falls to be considered as a non-complying activity, in my view, this does need to be assessed with reference to the district plan provisions. The district plan standards are intended to implement the objectives and policies and provide us with a good benchmark for understanding what is anticipated by the plan, although that doesn't mean that you need to adhere strictly to it. The proposed sites, particularly lots 1 to 16, obviously don't meet the district plan lot size standards, but they do meet, and in some cases go further than the other district plan standards. For example, proposed maximum building height is limited to 5.5 metres as against 7.5 in the plan. External boundary setback distances are all exceeded. And the application also proposes further landscaping to assist in screening development and help contain it within the upper terrace of the application site. Mr. Costello has produced an alternative subdivision concept plan that would demonstrate what's achieved by a so-called compliant subdivision. Such a proposal in our submission would lead to domestication being scattered across the wider application site, affecting the openness of the more publicly visible parts of the application site on the lower terraces. And the key provisions in the plan, such as Objective 4.3.3, seek to maintain and, where practicable, enhance rural amenity values, which are created by the open space, landscape, natural character and built environment values of an area. This indicates that rural amenity values are supported by a combination of things. Different locations or different applications will exhibit a range of characteristics in different degrees and in different ways. And this is also reflected by the provisions of the plan which seek to manage land use activities and subdivision to ensure that adverse effects are avoided, remedied and mitigated. The provisions of the district plan are effects based, and there is a fair bit of nuance depending on the nature of the rural environment that the application is proposed within. And paragraph 42A through to C, I just highlight some of the ways that that is done. The explanation to policy 4.4.10 states that minimum allotment sizes for subdivision are considered to be the best practical method to control adverse effects. In some instances, adherence to an arbitrary minimum is not always the most appropriate approach. It's submitted that this clearly indicates that lot size controls are effectively a gatekeeper, but the plan anticipates there will be instances when applications that do not comply with those standards will be appropriate. It's submitted that this philosophy is reflected in the policies 4.4.2 and 4.4.3 and the effects-based approach that they take. And I refer you there to the Harrison CODC decision, where the court observed the subdivision policy anticipates there being differences in effects in directing avoidance, remediation or mitigation depending on the effect you're managing and the level of effect. Which method will be required will depend on the characteristics of the landscape. Policy 4.4.2 identifies a suite of levers available for managing effects. And in my submission, the application here has pulled those levers through controls on the location of dwellings to the terrace that is less visible, allowing the balanced land, which is roughly 130 hectares, to be maintained as open rural land, and with controls on building height, making the most of the surrounding planting topography, and then the conditions proposing additional mitigation planting to mitigate the effects of the residual visibility from Jolly Road. And in my submission, these combination of things demonstrate the application has done exactly what the district plan expects. Now, paragraph 48, I'll just point you to the Align report, which identified the characteristics of the surrounding area. It identified the strong rural character exhibited by the shelter belts, divided paddocks and irrigation infrastructure, the expansive and open character, particularly of the lower terraces, the views available to the wider hills, and this relatively sparse pattern of built form. These characteristics have been responded to in the application by utilising the top terrace, the existing shelter belts to screen and contain the built form that would arise from the development. The proposed planting along the Molyneux farmland and Jolly Road will reinforce that existing character and this element of that rural character within the environment. Secondly, keeping the built form off lower terraces, which are more visible from public locations, enabling that existing expansive and open character to be maintained throughout the majority of the site. Turning now to matters of precedent and plan integrity. As you all know, both of those things are not considered to be environmental effects, although may be relevant to your consideration under section 104(1)(c). And I've highlighted there at paragraph 52 the current leading case in relation to precedent and plan integrity and its role in decision making. For the reasons set out in the evidence filed for the applicant, the effects of the application will be no more than minor, and the application is not contrary to the district plan objectives and policies. And in my view, that means that issues of precedent and plan integrity are not material in this application. And this is particularly so in light of the district plan's effect-based policy framework. The court noted in Harris that where effects are no more than minor, plan integrity is unlikely to be affected. Secondly, applications that are yet to be determined or yet to be filed are not part of the environment and are not an effect of this application. On this basis, it is not appropriate to speculate about what other land users might do in the future. Those applications, if they were to eventuate, need to be assessed against the environment that exists at the time. The proposed application is a specific response to the application site and its topography, particularly the visually contained and less productive top terrace. As opposed to an alternative layout which is driven by strict adherence to the lot size standards in the plan, which would result in domestication being sprinkled across the entire site, and in particular the more visible lower terraces. These features will not be present in all locations, and the proposed farm park arrangement is perhaps unlikely to be considered desirable by everybody. As stated in Wellington Regional Council, to even consider future applications as a potential effect or cumulative effect is to make a totally untenable assumption the consent authority will allow the dike to be breached without evincing any further interest or control, merely because it granted one consent. The Section 42A report concludes that proposals should be assessed on their own merits, and I agree. Turning to the evidence filed by Ms. Dorr on behalf of the Regional Council, And evidence obviously maintains strident opposition to the application. And so I work through the matters in that evidence in some detail. Firstly, the discussion of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. Ms. Daw provides some extensive quotes of the provisions of the NPSFM, which I assume were included because of the ORC's view that a communal wastewater system should be required for the subdivision. I note that the applicant provided supporting engineering information on the appropriateness of the proposed wastewater management in the application, and Mr. Morris, an engineer himself, also discusses this topic in his evidence. Ms. Daw does not provide any evidential basis for her general view that communal wastewater systems should be used, other than pointing to the fact that they have been used elsewhere. We're provided with no information about those circumstances, such as the scale or the density. It might be that the communal systems in those cases were entirely appropriate. Developments may have been in areas with shallow groundwater, for example, or have had site topography that made communal systems effective. Ms. Daw has not provided information about the characteristics of this site or this area that call into question the information provided by the applicant. Namely, groundwater is relatively deep and that a secondary treatment system is appropriate. As discussed by Mr. Morris, a communal system is not required to achieve secondary treatment. It is submitted that when assessing this application, the approach that may have been taken in other unidentified locations is irrelevant. The Commission has been provided with specific information to inform this decision. The issues associated with the communal system have been set out by the evidence, and as discussed by Mr. Morris, a communal system at this site will not achieve a higher level of treatment, will create different risks with greater costs. The evidence in this case demonstrates that efficient and effective wastewater infrastructure can be provided on a site-by-site basis. In the same section of evidence, Ms. Daw goes on to express concerns about the use of roof water in the application. I note the NPSFM includes policy direction that seeks to ensure water is allocated and used efficiently. The applicant has sought to minimise allocation pressure by incorporating roof capture systems into the subdivision. I would have thought such an approach would have been applauded by a regional council that has concerns about over-allocation. The ORC also raised questions about the applicant's evidence that the top terrace is less productive because the applicant has proposed to irrigate the proposed landscape planting. It must be noted that irrigation of the top terrace or pastoral irrigation of the top terrace would require pumping and infrastructure for some 42 hectares. This is an entirely different proposition from irrigation for approximately 3,000 square metres of screen planting. The ability to develop irrigation for landscaping is effectively being enabled and subsidised by the proposed rural living development. The applicant has discussed how irrigation of the top terrace is considered undesirable due to water availability issues from the Lindis scheme and viability. It is also likely to be constrained in its ability to expand irrigation in this area by the national environmental standards. Messaging from the ORC is, in my view, inconsistent and irreconcilable. On the one hand, we should not expand irrigation because water is over-allocated. We should intensify rural land uses because of water quality concerns, but nor are we and should we be using our less productive land in other ways. Turning to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, Ms. Daw assesses the application with reference to the NPS UD. Now, the NPS for urban development applies to local authorities that have an urban environment within their district and to planning decisions, which include resource consent decisions that affect urban environments. Objective 6 requires decisions on urban development that affect urban environments to be integrated with infrastructure, strategic over the medium and long term, and responsive to demand. Currently, there are no qualifying urban environments identified within the Central Otago district. It goes without saying that Terrace is not an urban environment, and therefore it is submitted that the NPSUD is simply not a relevant consideration for this application. Further, this proposal does not constitute urban development. Ms. Dawes' evidence appears to ignore the inextricable link between the 16 rural living lots and the farm lot. And to put it another way, it would be an unusual residential development to provide in excess of 8 hectares of open space for each residential section. Turning to reverse sensitivity effects, once again, the ISC's evidence does not appear to take into account the specific nature of the proposal. The owners of the rural living lots will also own the farm. This will result in future purchasers having an interest in and affinity with the farming activity on the balanced land. And the activity on the farming block will surround the rural living lots and insulate them from activities on neighbouring land. And I note the applicant has agreed with both adjacent landowners, being Greenlight and Molyneux Farm, to increase the setback of the proposed sections from 25 metres required by the district plan to 50 metres. Ms. Dawes draws your attention to recent circumstances of conflict between residents and rural activities, in particular horticultural activities such as frost fighting and bird scaring. It's noted that there are no horticultural activities in close proximity to this site, while some exist in the wider area such as Marley Point Road. The nature of the area is quite different from the likes of Earnscleugh, Cromwell or Dunstan Flats, where there are more residents and more intensive rural land uses. I also question the relevance of a comparison to the circumstances of Plan Change 13. As the panel will no doubt recall, that plan change involved a proposed rezoning of roughly 40 hectares to provide for approximately 900 residential sections and associated facilities. The proposed site was sandwiched between Highlands Motorsport Park, Suncrest Orchards and the State Highway. The question there was about the fundamental compatibility of high-density residential development in an area where residential amenity would be severely compromised. Here, we have a large piece of rural land capable of being subdivided in line with district plan rules to provide for 16 rural allotments. What is proposed is to subdivide the land to provide for 16 rural allotments and a large farm block. The existing environment includes pastoral farming activities, shelter planting, neighbouring rural living development. Conditions are proposed in the consent that will ensure shelter planting is maintained and established along the boundary with Molyneux Farm, and a covenant has been proposed that will highlight the nature of the rural environment to residents. It is submitted that these measures address Ms. Dawes' concerns about the likes of dust and light spill from neighbouring land, and those effects may arise from the farm block itself, being land jointly owned by the rural living lots within the site. It seems unlikely at best that those residents will complain to council about their own farming operation. Given all of that and the nature of the area, it is submitted that reverse sensitivity effects are a low risk, and this is a circumstance where a covenant is an adequate response. I've just pointed there to the fact Molyneux Farm has now provided its affected party approval, so any adverse effects arising on that land are not a relevant matter. Turning to the impact on productive land, Ms. Dawes considers the proposal as contrary to the provisions of the partially operative policy statement because a small portion of the land will be used for rural living. In response to that, I note the following. The level of rural living proposed in the application is equivalent to that anticipated by the density rules in the district plan. It is effectively the same number, just configured in a different way. Arguably, it reduces the extent of effect on productive capacity by clearly containing the area of land that can be used for rural living to the approximately 2,000 square metres per dwelling. Such limitations are less likely to be imposed if a more traditional subdivision layout was proposed. In those circumstances, areas of rural living and curtilage could extend far beyond the size of the sections proposed here. Secondly, the site does not contain significant soils, and the retention of a large balanced lot will maintain the vast majority of the productive potential of the site, thereby minimising the subdivision of rural land in smaller lots. It is submitted the configuration of the proposal is in fact consistent with the direction of the partially operative regional policy statement. At paragraph 58, Ms. Dawes states that precedent is the ORC's primary concern. This concern appears to arise from the size of lots 1 to 16 and a view that these lots comprise residential development. As I've said, I think in reaching that conclusion, Ms. Dawes has not had adequate regard to the ownership structure of the balanced lot and the effect that common ownership of this lot will have on the nature of the rural living allotments. In my view, this is a significant omission that ignores a key plank of the proposal and which distinguishes it from more typical rural subdivision proposals. This is not an urban area within a rural zone, and as I mentioned above, it would be extremely unusual for an urban lot to come with roughly 8 hectares of farmland. But at the end of the day, the RMA is an effects-based statute. The detailed effects assessment carried out by the applicant's team and confirmed in the Section 42A report concludes that the effects of this proposal are no more than minor. In such circumstances, issues of precedent really do not arise. At paragraph 76, Ms. Dawes points to the neighbouring land creating a visual precedent. I've interpreted Ms. Dawes' comments to really be about cumulative effects of the proposal in conjunction with the neighbouring development. In my view, the discussion in the Align report of the neighbouring Greenlight development relates to the assessment of the existing rural character and amenity of the site and the surrounding area, and whether the proposed application will change or alter the existing landscape character and amenity. The ability for the site to contain the proposed development means the proposal will not detract from the surrounding character of sparse-built form and enables the open pastoral character of the large balanced lot and lower terraces to be maintained. Further, the internal arrangement of the lots creates small clusters within the upper terrace that allows the built form to be read together and lessens the impact on openness on that upper terrace. Ultimately, with mitigation in the form of shelter belt planting, which is consistent with the character of the surrounding area, the Align report concludes that effects will be low. As discussed by Mr. Costello, the landscape mitigation has been incorporated into the proposal and will be established prior to Section 224C approval. No expert landscape assessment has been produced by the ORC, and therefore Ms. Dawes' opinions related to landscape matters should be viewed cautiously. They are not supported by the landscape evidence. Finally, it is not up to this applicant or this commission to speculate about what future applications may or may not be made. This was a matter I addressed previously. And if further applications were to be made, they must be assessed against the landscape as it exists at the time and on their own merits. So finally, as set out in Mr. Costello's evidence, the development will provide a unique rural living opportunity within the terrace area. The proposed rural living has been concentrated on the less productive land that is less amenable to more intensive farming due to challenges associated with establishing pastoral irrigation. The upper terrace also enables the proposed development to be well contained using mitigation methods consistent with the existing rural character of the area, while maintaining the open character of the majority of the site. The proposed farm park will allow the majority of the site to be farmed as a contiguous and productive farm block and gives residents of the rural sections a strong and vested interest in the ongoing productivity of that land. It is a feature of the application that will manage the potential for reverse sensitivity effects. Proposed conditions relating to building height, location of the sections will also help mitigate potential effects and visibility. In light of that evidence, it is submitted the proposal passes both limbs of the Section 104D gateway, and that granting consent will achieve the purpose of the Act. So that is it from me at this point. So happy to field any questions.
Just check with the panel. I have none.
Neither have
Sarah,
I.
none. Martin, none. No, we're all good. Thanks, Ms. Irving.
Excellent.
Thank you for setting it out so that we understand what you're telling us.
Very good. So I propose to call Mr. Morris now. So Lloyd, have you got your video on?
Good morning.
Mr. Morris, how are you?
Very well, thank you, sir.
As I said earlier, we have received your brief of evidence. We have read it, but it will be very helpful if you will take us through the relevant or important parts you want to make sure that we are well aware of.
Thank you for that. We've always lived on rural blocks ourselves as a family, and we were moving down there. And one of the problems we've always found is on the properties we've owned is it's often referred to as the small holdings or a life sentence, and we found that we were spending a significant amount of time maintaining the property, and so we were looking for a more elegant way of making this work. And a local farmer has been, as per my evidence, Johnny Trevathan has been working the property and working it very well. And so the thought came, well, why don't we locate all the properties, the subdivision on the top terrace in behind the existing shelter belts that are up there. And the shelter belts are needed for protection for the stock anyway, for sun and the pretty rugged weather that can come through down there. And so they just would tuck in quite nicely in behind. And that top terrace has got the lucerne crop on it. And so we wanted to be able to continue cropping that. So we dotted the lots around. Has to be enough separation. They either have to be completely beside one another so that you can combine a lot if somebody just wants to build one house on two lots, or there has to be sufficient room between the lots so that you can drive the harvesting equipment, when you're baling. So that was fine, and we thought, well, if we put it up there, you also can't see it from state highways 8 and 8A. And then we wouldn't have to worry about access off a state highway, because if we had a formal access down on State Highway 8A, there's always an increased, it's a high speed environment, an increased risk, if you like. Having the access off Jolly Road in what is, in practical terms, a cutting, there's less visibility. So that's part of what our thinking was at that stage. And the other thing was that the groundwater up on the top terrace is over 10 metres down. In fact, the terrace landfill immediately next door, the old rubbish tip has got testing bores, and they're dry and they go down to 20 metres. So there's no groundwater up close to the surface. So in terms of disposal of wastewater through septic tanks, it's not going to be a problem. Our thinking was that we would use a septic tank, and at this stage I'm looking at a gravity system using the AES system. In fact, I'm just making an application for the main house and the workers' cottage right now on that terrace using that system. And the reason is you can then locate each wastewater system on each lot, taking into account exactly where the house is and sheds and how everything's going to be located. So it's in our view, it was a more elegant and specifically designed system. Gives the level of treatment that Otago Regional Council is after. It's just done again in a different way. And then we don't have the issues of that come with a communal system, which requires it all to be built before section 224, even when there's relatively well, there won't be any houses at that point, but to make a communal system work, you need all the houses online pretty much at the same time. If you can get it to work with the gravity, the distance and the gravity, and you don't get solid dropout. So that's what we were thinking up there. I'm not quite sure what else there is that I can offer that the commissioners might be interested in. There's obviously quite a bit of thought gone into it, but everybody sees things slightly differently. So is there any questions I can answer specifically from yourselves?
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Yeah, very helpful, and the structure of your evidence is very helpful to address the issues that you've summarised for us. So thank you. My question is, you rightly point out in your evidence that this is something that district plans don't, in terms of the style of subdivision, district plans don't generally envisage, but is becoming, I think, by your words, a little bit more popular is the wrong word, but a little bit more prevalent. What I'm interested in is, in particular, the 17th lot as a farm lot, and the proposed consent condition around that not being able to be subdivided into the future. One of the things I've learned over many years doing this sort of stuff is that, despite the fact that you can propose that and put that in place, someone one day is going to potentially test that, the resolve of the councils or whoever it might be in the future, to keep that condition valid and live. Can you envisage any situation where it might be the right thing to do to subdivide lot 17 further? Or is it something you haven't turned your mind to?
No, we did give it some thought. If the 16 lots are all in individual ownership, it would be like trying to herd cats to try and get common agreement, because the very reason why people have purchased in that location is for and built a house is for a particular reason. It's difficult to imagine a forward circumstance where that could be required. I suppose the district plan could be changed over time. It's a natural thing, but even if that was to happen, then the 8 hectares would also be, which is the standard rural zoning, would also could also be tested were the zoning to be changed. So it's something that's not unique to a farm park situation. I'm just sort of thinking as we're talking, the landing up in Kerikeri, Manganese Point in Whangarei Harbour, Goodlands in Dairy Flat, closer to home is Hilleen Station over at Wanaka, Bendemeer. The same sort of situation, same sort of question that you've asked is probably a relevant one, a relevant question for those developments as well. And they seem to have stood, at least to this point anyway, the test of time, not come under pressure for rezoning. I think the rezoning would start at the council end anyway, wouldn't it? If there was a change of zoning.
Yes, and what was in my mind a little bit was saying if half of the joint owners wanted to be able to sell their lot, if you like, and split it up, and half didn't, then they could actually seek a plan change or a consent to try and make that happen. But I'm picking the way it would work is that there'd be a subdivision consent condition that would not enable it to happen, but also the ownership structure would say, I'm picking it would require 100% agreement of the lot owners to make it happen. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes, that is a correct assumption, because we would have our own covenants, private covenants that would come down on the lot titles. We have to address, to put it in a simple terms, things like pets, dogs on a working farm. We don't want car bodies dropped around the place, so there's a whole range of housekeeping items, and this would form one of those. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think that satisfies my my question. Thank you, Martin. Stephen.
I'm good. Interested in the communal wastewater system. I don't see how gravity would work on that. I think that would have to be a pump scheme.
Yes.
Yeah.
Martin, you're all good.
Yeah, no, I'm happy. That was my query too about how you actually manage that joint farm lot. But I'm happy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Morris. Appreciate that very much. Very helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. I'll now ask Mr. Costello just to briefly summarise his evidence and field any questions.
Thank you. Alrighty.
Morning all. In the interest of time, I'm probably not going to go all the way through my hearing evidence. I think it's been pretty well covered off by Bridget and Lloyd so far. So I think I'm just going to speak to a couple of points and then let you guys come back to me if you've got any questions. Probably one thing I think that we could slightly better highlight is the positive effects of the proposal. Obviously, this is somewhat unconventional for Central Otago District, but it does provide a new greenfield development near Terrace, an area which is, well, most of Central Otago is in some need of new greenfield development where it can be provided, especially if it's a rural living type of development. And this one's also particularly unique in that it's not going to be in conflict with other kind of rural uses, mainly through its design and how the topography of the land lies. The other positive effect worth consideration is that as part of this, we are proposing to do some sealing of Jolly Road. The actual point of sealing is still to be determined, depending on discussions with the Greenlight next door, who have a similar consent condition on their consent. But undertaking the sealing will reduce the dust generation along the road, as well as ongoing maintenance and long-term costs for the council as well. So I think we've covered off rural and visual amenity effects pretty well. I would just say that we have, as part of the Section 92 response, we did go spend a fair bit of time getting the Line Limited involved, basically drawing on their expertise just to work out the actual effects of the proposal on landscape and natural character and that type of thing. And I think generally Kirsten and myself and the applicant, of course, are in agreement that with the proposed mitigations that we can make sure that any effects on landscape are no more than minor. So as part of my hearing evidence, I submitted we prepared a structure landscape plan. This is basically kind of an example of what we could do for the site. So we kind of want to continue on what Greenlight have already done, basically expanding a similar style of planting along that northern boundary, mainly to help screen the property from Jolly Road when you're travelling in a southeast direction. Basically, we just want to make sure that the development is going to be screened in a way that's not going to stick out like a sore thumb or anything like that, just so it looks like typical kind of rural dwellings set in a rural environment. And then helping have those trees planted should help sort of get the proposal to fit in with the surrounding area. In terms of productive values of land, again, pretty well covered off. We've designed the subdivision so that all the lots are sitting around the edges of the top terrace, basically making sure that the bulk of that area on the top terrace can still be used for lucerne cropping. As well, it kind of gives everyone a sense of space on that top terrace as well. Reverse sensitivity, I think, has also been pretty well covered off. Anyone who's purchased a lot on the property will be doing so because they want to live in a farming environment. And I think it's highly unlikely that anyone's going to complain about noise that's happening on their own property, of which they'd own a 17th of anyway. In terms of servicing, we commissioned Mount Iron Geodrill just to do a geotech investigation of the site. Basically, we just wanted to confirm that what we're proposing was viable. So Mount Iron Geodrill confirmed that on-site wastewater can be done within each lot. These aren't small lots, they're 1,800 each, so there is space within each, even if there is a house. Basically, as long as the wastewater systems are installed on a bed of sand, which helps slow down any kind of contaminants as they're discharged, then there should be no effects on groundwater, particularly as groundwater is so deep in this area. And I provided that report to Kirsten as well as a separate memo from them as well. Apart from that, I think Bridget pretty adequately covered off cumulative effects. Transport effects, I think, are going to be positive overall with the proposed ceiling. And apart from that, I think from a planning perspective, that's all from me.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. Just one question, because you said when you're just speaking then about each person will have a 17th share. I'm being picky, but they'll have a 16th share, won't they?
Yes.
Right.
Well done, Neil. Good maths.
That's right. I'm sure you did it on purpose, so you said just as if I was listening, but I thought.
Yeah, you were. Well done.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. No, thank you for that. I have no questions of you. Thank you, Stephen.
No, nothing from me.
Martin.
Nothing, thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Perfect.
So that is it from us at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Irving. Now, Anita, you had a time constraint, or was it already gone? I can't remember.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, unfortunately, Anita has had to go off to a High Court appointment.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but yeah, just the way it works in these situations.
Yeah, if you do have any questions for her, I'm happy to take them, or if they can be put through to her in writing, should be happy to clarify anything that would be helpful.
Well, while I've got the ORC then on the hook, so to speak, we've got the statement of evidence that's the evidence has been provided. Is there anything in particular you want to point out to us to make sure that we're aware of any changes, any other views to supplement that evidence that Anita's filed, Mr. Hanley?
Thank you, Chair. I don't think so. Unfortunately, we really didn't have the benefit of seeing the evidence lodged this morning from Brodie or Bridget. Obviously, legal submission can come quite late. I think I'm cautious not to add to Anita's opinions, but perhaps just a couple of things I've picked up on that might be helpful. I did try to keep up with Bridget's tour de force presentation, which was thorough as always. In terms of the gateway test, I understand Bridget's point. The only thing I would say to that is that's assuming that the district plan does give effect to the RPS, the partially operative RPS, which I think Anita did cover off some concerns that it doesn't in certain areas. In terms of water supply, I may have picked it up wrong, but I again understand the point that perhaps OIC should be supportive of sustainable methods such as rainwater collection. I think Anita's evidence pointed out that the question is, that's very nice, but is it practical? I don't believe there was any climate expert evidence provided to show that would be viable. And that goes back to the issues, I think, why the NPSUD in particular was referenced, that if you're going to have this sort of development, which might be called rural living, an aspiration, but by its character, it appears to have more in common with urban residential development, then you want to be strategically thinking about servicing for such a development. In terms of cumulative effects and in the landscape space, I think we would just reiterate the concern that the alignment report, I believe, references the Greenlight development. The Greenlight development was a discretionary activity, so it was compliant and consistent with the policy framework in the district plan, which is why IRC didn't have any concerns with that particular development. When we looked at it, this proposal is quite different. So that comes back to, our main concern was precedent that this development, if granted, could create.
Thank you. I'm not going to have a discussion about precedent, because every time you do, there's different views about where it ultimately ends up, and it usually turns out not to be that helpful. Can I just expand on the rainwater side of things? Is the concern there around the potability of that rainwater, or the volume?
I think it would be just the quality is a question, but I think our concern was the quantity, like how much you could rely on it. I believe Anita's evidence to suggest perhaps a ball might be more realistic in terms of sustainability of supply. Although as we've heard, depth to groundwater is 20 metres plus, I believe. So obviously that has a cost implication as well. If it is feasible, that's not something I'll comment on any further from a technical point of view.
And I'm picking at the end of the day that if rainwater is not enough for one, it's not enough for 16, and the saving grace could be, I guess, is that whatever happens with this is that ultimately they're going to need water from somewhere. And while the top terrace may be difficult, there's probably other opportunities on the bottom terrace where I suspect it's probably a lot closer to the source. But yeah, no, I understand that. Thank you. And so nothing further you want to add?
No. As I said, if there's any specific questions, burning questions related to Anita's evidence, she's more than happy to answer that in writing.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for that.
We'll turn that around quickly too.
My concerns were about the rainwater too, considering apart from the last couple of days we don't get a huge amount of rain, the reliance of it. But you're right, Neil, as far as that, obviously another source of water will need to be found, especially for potable drinking water. You can't rely on rainwater.
Stephen?
No, already noted.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Hanley. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Now, I guess if I go back to, I'm going to follow my list I've got. Hudson Dimmock, you're next on my list. So unless someone says from Mr. White or Mr. Goddard are desperately urgent to get in front of you, Hudson Dimmock, please.
I've got no further comments. Just wanted to say I was supportive, and but that's also appreciate your time and reading the evidence. Thank you.
Thank you for your succinct and clear submission.
Cheers.
There's some people that have been at other hearings before you that you should talk to as to how to do that. Not today, of course. Move on to Greenlight Land. Chris White.
Yes, hello. Thank you. I just a little bit of background. Obviously, have the resource consent next door to the east, Greenlight Land. I think Commissioner Ray, CODC, Dave Whitney in late 2009. In general, not opposed. I suppose through the lack of questioning today, and submissions against. It's clearly a well thought out proposal and ticks a lot of boxes on behalf of Douglas Developments. I'm not sure what constitutes an expert. From my standpoint, I have done lifestyle developments which buttress up against residential living and with rural neighbours in the past, and have successfully sold those down. I also own another 100 acres which has the same and consent and ability to do that, and looking to purchase more in and around people living in large lifestyle lots in a rural environment. I do think, from the standpoint of committing several $1 million to this, being hands-on, certainly trying to be appreciative of the rural environment is important. I do think in my submission, we would look to not oppose, and we look to support the consent, but there is 2 pages that we feel very strongly. I do feel as though the density up on the terrace, and while that is where it is best to locate residential dwellings from a lack of viewing site points and lanes, and they've got significant shelter belts and the like, I do think 16 lots up there that typically average in the 12 to 1500 square meter basis, they do typically, that does look more residential like. We would support less lots, given the consent next door where we have 9 8-hectare minimum lots. We are in direct line of sight of the proposed development. I think it would be more in keeping with the existing consent to lessen the lots, particularly along our boundary, or that would destroy other lines of sight, you know, where people locate homes towards the sun, the northwest corridor, which would typically be where most of our sites would look towards directly into the west, which is the Douglas development. The other major issue of contention, and no one has reached out to us recently, would be the sealing of the roads, traffic counts, and whatever consent would be issued here for Douglas developments if it was to be approved. We're pretty vehement and strong in our position, whether it's via this resource consent or what happened to us with the Jollies on Jolly Road, where they took us through the district court in order to get further sealing of the road beyond what Commissioner Ray and the CODC originally requested. If we use 8 traffic movements per day, average traffic movements per day, we would just ask that whatever the number of lots that Douglas development was successful with, that there would be a sharing in the proportional costs from the State Highway 8 current sealed road through to Greenlight's entrance and then on up to the Douglas development's entrance. And so that's what we're most interested in. Outside of that, we're relatively supportive. I do think the house height, as noted in the Greenlight resource consent, is 5.5 meters. We would be vehemently opposed to anything that was 2-story, but I do understand in the CODC District Council you possibly can go higher than 5.5 meters, but we've asked for restrictions there as well. So we would prefer 5.5 meters and similar to the existing consent next door, but we would oppose anything beyond 7.5 meters.
So just make sure I heard that right. So you'd oppose anything greater than 7.5 meters.
Yes, and I'm not sure if you've got my full consent submission. Yeah,
yep,
and I think we laid it out there pretty clearly. And look, we think in general, in talking to Lloyd, I think he's come up with a great plan. I wish more people would come up with a plan along these lines. I think it's something you will see more of. I do think it's a natural progression. Even Commissioner Ray and Dave Whitney and myself, we all agreed that it was highly likely upon our successful consent that you would see more development. The terrace node has been somewhat left behind over the years, and I viewed our initial going through the consent was a way to create more people living within the rural environment and become part of the community. Lloyd's added to that. While I do disagree with the high level of density that he has put up on the terrace, we would prefer that to be lower.
Cool. Yep, I understand that. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks, guys.
Thank you for your submission, and we do have it in full within our paperwork, so we have seen it all. And as part of our deliberations, obviously, some of those issues we'll work through. Anything from you, Martin? Any questions?
Nothing, thank you.
Stephen?
Nothing from me, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. White. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Right, we don't have Molyneux Farm Limited. They've now given their approval as an affected party, so whatever they thought doesn't matter anymore. Mr. Goddard, you should be last on my list.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and make this short and succinct as well. So my name's Chris Goddard, terrace landowner for the last 7 years and resident for 2. And as a new resident to the community, I've picked up 2 themes that I'd like to reinforce today. One is the Terrace Community Plan, and although it's an old plan from August 2007, it's currently being reworked, but it still talks to sustainable residential growth while retaining the rural environment and feel. And I support the proposal as it meets those 2 criteria of the community plan. The other is that we ran a community survey about another proposed development August-September 2021, where we sampled 183 families around a 10-kilometre radius from Terrace. We got a 41% response rate, which for a community survey is almost unheard of. And although the survey showed very limited support for the proposed industrial development, one thing the survey did tell us is that all of the respondents, so all 41% of the 183 families, wanted a vibrant community with more residential growth. So I'm open to any questions the panel may have on those 2 points.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Appreciate that. Just out of idle curiosity and just to get a feel for where the submitters come from, whereabouts is your property in the Terrace area?
So we're in Marry Point Road, on the banks of the Mata'ao, next to Marry Point Vineyard.
Yeah, cool.
And,
thank you.
And to give you context, our bore is 31 metres deep. So we're on the banks of the Mata'ao, and it's a quite deep water table even here.
Yeah. So you just to pick up that, that'll be from the terrace above the river. So you're going through however many meters to the river level before you start anyway.
Yes, so it is quite an effort to get down there.
Yes, yeah, no, cool. No, I think that's just helpful to give a context, so we know. But thank you for your submission. I think it does set up those things very, very succinctly. I have no questions for you, Stephen.
Nothing from me.
Nothing from me.
Right. Thanks, Mr. Goddard. I appreciate that. And please don't be concerned there's no questions. No point asking something that we've already been told or already got in front of us. So,
thank you.
Right. Unless I've missed someone, there's no one else joined, no one else expecting the call. Better unmute yourself and hurry up. Otherwise, Ms. Irving, back to you. Oh, hang on. Whoa, no. Hang on. Whoa, one moment. I think I've missed someone very important.
Good.
I should really go to the planning consultant first, shouldn't I? Whoops. Ms. Lindsay, how are you this morning?
Good, thank you.
Oh, I've done it again. Sorry.
It's all right. No worries. I do have a little bit to say, so you'll have to bear with me. So if I turn my mind first to the applicant's evidence, I appreciate the timely preparation of the structural landscaping plan and consider that this provides more certainty regarding the likely mitigation outcomes of this. I consider that it also provides for the planting to be well established before much of the development occurs. I note that the applicant has confirmed that further development of the communal buildings will require resource consent should this not be used for a permitted rural activity. In terms of the conditions set out in Brodie's evidence, I agree with the proposed changes to conditions 1, 6, 14B6, 15, 16 and 18C, but make the following comments. In addition to the proposed change for condition 6, I agree with this, but I note that the reference will need to change from Public House South to Taumata Arawai. In terms of condition 17, I agree with the intent of this condition, but consider it that it perhaps should read the landscape planting identified by the structure landscape plan must be established and maintained in accordance with the landscape management plan prepared under condition 15. I'm just not sure if that's an error or if I've misinterpreted what was intended. In terms of condition 18B, my preference would be the second option promoted by Brodie at his paragraph 71, and that just refers, that's talking about the gates and the fencing, and I just prefer there to be some controls around the gates. I support the staging condition, and I also agree with the proposed change to condition 20, which regards the further subdivision of lot 17. And I note just in regards to the discussion before that the ownership of lot 17 will be jointly held by lots 1 through 16 and would require further agreement to be further subdivided or on-sold. And so I agree with Mr. Lloyd that it would be like herding cats, I would imagine, to get agreement of 16 parties. In regard to the point raised in Brodie's paragraph 35, I note that the Mount Iron Geodrill report forms part of the agenda, and in this regard it was circulated to submitters in a timely manner. In terms of conditions 9 and 10, which relate to the communal wastewater system, I consider that the applicant has raised some valid concerns regarding this condition as recommended. They have provided expert evidence that the commissioners can rely on. And I also acknowledge the point that these lots will not be developed at once, which does potentially affect the viability of a communal system. In respect of the road ceiling at paragraph 59 of Brodie's evidence, while the ceiling required by Greenlight does form part of the receiving environment, this has not yet been given effect to, and there's no mechanism by which council can require Greenlight subdivision to proceed. And so the condition as set out in the section 42A report ensures that the road will be sealed in its entirety should Greenlight not give effect to its subdivision. That is, so we don't get patches of sealed and unsealed road in a single stretch. Right, turning my mind now to the evidence provided by ORC. I note the reference to clause 3.5D of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, which encourages the coordination and sequencing of regional or urban growth. Given the language of that clause, I would suggest that this is a high-level policy to be applied at a policy-making level when considering the provision of urban growth areas, rather than in a resource consent level for a rural subdivision. In regard to the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, I consider Ms. Irving is correct. Central Otago does not currently meet the definition of an urban environment. And in response to ORC's assessment of Policy 10 of the NPSUD, this relates to urban environments and seeks to manage the provision of infrastructure. In my reading, this policy is directed at the expansion of urban development and ensures urban infrastructure is strategically and affordably extended. In my opinion, it does not reasonably apply to this development. I consider that the site is not within an urban environment as defined and is of a rural and not urban character. Furthermore, the applicant will be providing its own infrastructure and does not seek to extend the infrastructure network. There is no physical ability to integrate the infrastructure, with urban development, as this is not a serviced or intended to be serviced area. In respect of ORC's assessment of the proposed partially operative RPS, I question the emphasis placed on objective 4.5 relating to urban growth and development. In my assessment, the proposal does not risk the carrying capacity of existing infrastructure or services, as there is to be no connection to existing infrastructure. I consider the ORC have overstated that this application should be treated as urban growth. I consider that it should be viewed as a rural subdivision only. Under the current planning framework, it is not identified as a rural growth, urban growth area under policy 4.5.1a. However, if an assessment under policy 4.51 is required, I consider that the design of the subdivision is an efficient use of rural land when compared to 16 8-hectare blocks anticipated by the plan, and it continues to provide for rural production activities on the 129-hectare balanced lot. I consider that reverse sensitivity effects are able to be managed through separation distances to external boundaries. In addition, the written approval of Molyneux Farms, who are the adjacent neighbour, have now been provided. All effects on this party are to be disregarded. I note that each lot owner will also own a share of lot 17. And while ORC consider that these are urban scale lots in the middle of a working farm, it is in fact a farm that lots 1 through 16 will own. In this regard, I consider that they have a justifiable reason to reside in this environment and will, in all actuality, be contributing to the typical rural environment effects themselves. Policy 4.5.2 does not apply as there's no integration of infrastructure required or available, as this is a self-contained rural subdivision. Policy 4.5.3 does not apply as this is not new urban development. That said, I consider that the subdivision will be self-sufficient and therefore resilient. The built form is supported by expert assessment, and there is to be upgraded and direct access from Jolly Road to a state highway. Notwithstanding its assessment under the urban provisions of the PORPS, ORC then consider the provisions which relate to productive land also apply. I consider that the proposal meets objective 5.3 and that 129 hectares of the overall 132.6 hectares is retained in a productive use. And I consider that the 3.6 hectares of land set aside for residential purposes to be commensurate with that typically required for a discretionary 16 8-hectare lot development. It is my opinion that the 129 hectare block will be used cohesively and therefore more productively than 16 smaller rural lots being used disparately. In terms of policy 5.3.1, I consider that the proposal continues to enable primary production. There are no significant soils identified for the site, reverse sensitivity is adequately addressed, and the design of the subdivision appears to be expressly designed to maintain the large productive balanced lot while maximising the residential carrying capacity of the land. In this regard, I consider that the proposal will result in less fragmented rural land than a traditional rural subdivision anticipated by the district plan. I agree with ORC that little weight can be given to the proposed RPS 2021. I also note that the Land and Water Regional Plan is under development, has not been notified and cannot be given any weight in these proceedings. Almost there. With regard to ORC's concerns regarding precedent, I agree with Ms. Irving's submission. I also consider that the very nature and form of this development sets it apart from other rural subdivisions which have gone before this panel. In terms of the minimum lot sizes, I recognise the concerns raised by ORC. I agree that this type of farm park development was not anticipated at the time the plan was written and does not neatly fit within the rules. However, I note that while each lot individually is far smaller than that anticipated by the plan, each lot is held with an equal share of lot 17, i.e. 1/16 of the the 129 hectares will be included with each resultant title. Taking the 1/16th share of the 129 hectare block into consideration, the title for each lot 1 through 16 theoretically will have ownership of at least 8 hectares of land. In this regard, I consider that the proposal does not exceed the carrying capacity of the land as signalled by the district plan. I also consider this approach to be a more efficient use of land when compared to a standard rural subdivision. For these reasons, I do not consider this proposal merits a plan change approach. I note that ORC states that it did not submit on RC 190042, which is the adjacent Greenlight development, because it met the discretionary rules of the plan. When compared to the creation of the 16 8-hectare lots, which appears to find favour with ORC, I consider that the design of this subdivision provides for a theoretical density which exceeds 8 hectares per lot, but importantly, the balanced lot remains available for a more cohesive, productive land use as directed by both the district plan and the PORPS. Furthermore, assessment matter 15 of Rule 4743 of the district plan directs council to consider whether clustering should be implemented as a mean of mitigating potential effects of rural subdivision. And while this proposal is not assessed under that rule, I recognise that clustering is an anticipated mitigation tool identified by the district plan. I hold that the effects of the proposal can be managed by way of conditions, such that these are no more than minor, and the proposal is not contrary to the relevant objectives and policies, and therefore passes the gateway test set out in 104D. And just for clarification, I consider that it passes the objectives and is consistent with the objectives and policies in the PORPS. I continue to support the granting of consent subject to the recommended conditions put forward in my report, except where those amendments are identified above. Could you take questions?
I have to tell you, I had a big long list. Hang on, I have got a list, but I don't know if they're relevant for what I'm doing here. No, you covered the road ceiling, thank you. Now, forgive me if I missed in what you've just said, but in terms of the rainwater collection,
no, I didn't address that in the evidence. So in the section 42A report on page perhaps 22, which I'm not sure what it is on the agenda page, I'm sorry. I do talk about servicing, and so the water is to be supplied by various methods according to the application. So one is the rainwater. Secondly, there is an existing bore on the lower terrace of the property, which can be pumped up to the lots if required. There is the water from the Lindis irrigation scheme. There will be additional tanks buried for secondary rainwater collection. And also, according to the application, the applicant holds consent to establish 3 bores on the lower terrace. So potentially there are water options available to service it. Each lot's required to provide 1,000 litres per day. And so in that regard, I consider that there are a range of water options available, and point of treatment, treatment will be at the point of use.
Thank you. That's right. So you've just answered my question because I wrote down Plan B ? But I think you've just told me about plans B, C, and D. Thank you. I have no questions. Stephen?
No, nothing from me.
Martin?
Likewise, thank you.
You?
Yeah.
Right, yeah, I think I've done one. Thanks, Ms. Lindsay. Appreciate that. Been through that. But no, tick. So now back to the applicant for the right of reply, I believe. Ms. Lindsay. Sorry, Reserve, beg your pardon. My apologies.
No, that's okay. Thank you, sir. To be honest, I don't really have much more to add over and above what Ms. Lindsay has covered off. I tend to agree, I think, with both you and her that the ownership structure of the farm lot is a uniquely useful tool to prevent further subdivision of that balance lot. I think that common ownership structure will make it difficult for further subdivision to be implemented in the future over and above the consent notice condition to that effect. Just clarifying the relevance of the partially operative policy statement from a section 104D perspective. So not relevant in a 104D perspective, irrespective of a judgment about whether it's given effect to a partially operative policy statement. The partially operative policy statement, of course, becomes relevant under section 104(1)(b), and you might give some consideration to whether the district plan has given effect to the partially operative policy statement at that point when you're weighting your statutory documents. But I think, as Ms. Lindsay very capably set out, the unique characteristics of this subdivision, I think, have directly considered and implemented the direction of the partially operative policy statement. So I don't think anything turns on what might have happened with the district plan. The water supply, again, Ms. Lindsay in her section 42A report points to the suite of options available, and there are a suite. If we just look at the permitted activity rule for taking groundwater, we have an existing bore. We can get access to up to 25,000 litres currently. So I don't think we've got any difficulties in providing adequate water supply via combination of groundwater, rainwater and so on. The road sealing matter, I set out what I think is the point about the existing environment that's covered in Mr. Costello's evidence. There have been conversations that have taken place between Greenlight and the applicant, and they will continue. It would not be a vires condition for you to weigh into the proportionality of that, because it would require Greenlight's involvement, and so it's a third party that is not a party to the resource consent. So just pointing that out. And I would also agree with Ms. Lindsay's assessment of the relevance of the NPSUD to this application. I just really don't think that it is applicable here. Just double checking my notes. Yeah, so no, I don't think there's anything else I need to pick up on again.
Cool, thank you. I have one question which I'm almost hesitant to ask because it's always dangerous when you try and be a lawyer. I'm not trying to be. Is it possible to give effect to a partially operative regional policy statement through your district plan when it's not fully operative? Is that achievable?
Well, I suppose that the provisions that remain outstanding are relatively limited, and so I suppose in theory the district council could have responded to the provisions that have been made operative by way of district plan amendment. So in that sense, yes, it could be given effect to, but of course that given effect to would only be in part, because the policy statement itself is only operative in part. I think for the purposes of assessing this application, your better approach is to have direct regard to the provisions of the partially operative policy statement as they relate to the application, and consider those and look at how they might change perhaps your application or interpretation of the district plan provisions. I think in some respects that the CODC plan makes that relatively easy because you've got such an effects-based policy regime. So it allows for the application of those provisions to really adapt as things kind of change, and you can interpret and apply those provisions in light of the direction you get from the regional policy statement or national policy statements. So strangely, it's a helpful, I think, situation to find yourself in relative to district plans that might have taken a much more directive approach and then potentially end up sort of in more direct conflict between the district planning documents and the higher order documents as time passes.
Yeah, no, thank you. That does help me get in the right space for that. Right, thank you. I have no other questions or clarifications. Martin, Stephen?
No, nothing from me.
Ms. Lindsay, anything from that closing submission that you want to follow up on?
No, thank you.
Right, thank you. On that basis, I can advise then that the decision of the hearings panel is reserved. The formal decision will be in writing and available within the statutory period of 15 working days. In the event that the release of the decision is delayed, the applicant will be advised of the delay. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody, and especially having to do it in this Teams environment. It's not the best, but everybody's made it reasonably simple and straightforward. So thank you for getting evidence and stuff in a timely manner. Legal stuff at the last minute is always fun, but Ms. Irving, you did make a good job of taking us through that, which was helpful. So thank you. Otherwise, yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. We were due to finish before now, and we were due to commence with our next agenda item at 11. Can I ask, I see that the applicant is on board already. I'm going to ask you to wait for at least 5 minutes until 10 past 11, if you don't mind, please, so the panel can attend to things they need to attend to. And we'll be back and resume the hearing at 11:10 a.m. Rightio, good morning. Should be 10 past 11 according to my calculations. Nicole, are we all set to carry on?
We are, except the applicant has left and we are waiting for them to return.
Oh, cool. That's all right. I'm sure they'll be back shortly. Righto, it looks like we have our applicants team back on the line again now, so we shall continue with the next item on our agenda today, which is item 21.11.3, an application for resource consent RC 210335 for 119 Swan Road, Loburn. This is a properly convened meeting of the hearings panel called for the purpose of hearing submissions in relation to a resource application to undertake a two-lot subdivision at 119 Swan Road and also establish a building platform on the proposed lot 2. I'd ask the Minute Secretary to report on proceedings to date.
All statutory requirements under Section 95 of the Resource Management Act have been complied with. Report of the planning consultant has been circulated to Address for Service. The submissions received have been identified in the report.
Thank you. The following procedure will be followed for the hearing. The panel or officers may ask questions. Council officers or its consultants shall put any questions through the chair, and the chair shall be deemed to be the person asking the questions. The applicant or the applicant's representative shall make submissions and present evidence. The submitters or their representatives shall then make submissions and present evidence. The planning consultant shall then make their submission. The applicant shall write a reply, but shall not be permitted to again traverse the evidence nor raise new evidence. Before proceeding with the hearing, I'd ask that all parties appearing identify themselves. So I'll just manage this process, I think. I'm pretty sure, is it Mr. Hills, you've got the team on behalf of the applicant with you?
I do, yes, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm picking that in amongst that room. You should have the applicants at James Larson and Nina Yardley.
Yes.
And the fine gentleman in the middle would probably be the owner, might well be Roy Murdoch, is it? Excellent. Right, there's no one else in there that I can't see. No, it's good.
No one hiding, no.
That's good. And according to my list, there should be no one else on this call that's making any other submissions. So that should be making it reasonably straightforward. Of course, we have Kirsten Lindsay, our planning consultant, is there. I promise not to forget you this time, Ms. Lindsay. Right. I'll move that the report of the planning consultant be taken as read. Seconded, Martin.
Second.
All in favour?
All right.
Thanks, Stephen. Carried. Thank you. Mr. Hills, we'll pass over to you to take us through your submissions and evidence. And we have obviously received the submissions, and so I don't expect that they'll be read verbatim, but I'm more than happy for you to make sure that we have pointed out to us the bits that we need to know.
Yeah, thank you. Just in case anybody doesn't know me or doesn't remember me, I'm Campbell Hills. I've got about 7 years experience in resource management planning and engineering in this region. And I've been preparing this documentation, the plans, the application, the further information for the applicant. I decided that it wasn't really worthwhile overloading you with further written material. So I didn't submit any specific evidence for this hearing, but just prior to Christmas, obviously, I did submit the further information in response to the Okaha submission and some of the matters in the planning report sort of all interrelated, obviously, but that included the revised plan of the platform and how that related to the creek, the Charcoal Gully Natural Watercourse. So that being really the only critical outstanding matter as I saw it at the time. So yes, on the basis that you have read through the application and that further information, that sort of forms essentially all of our application and submission, being direct response to those matters that Ōkaha raised as, they wanted clarification or further information on. Yes, I suppose essentially what I'm saying then is that I'm certainly in agreement with the recommendations of the planners report and the conditions volunteered support the draft conditions of consent. Obviously, we view this site as being quite suitable for this type of proposal, given that it is obviously it is made up of quite distinctly different landform areas, with the front being proposed Lot 1 area being quite a separate unit as such from the Charcoal Gully area, where you've got a natural watercourse, a historic dam, and obviously the site is already bisected by those various features, including the access areas with shared right-of-way through to some of the properties to the west and the adjoining properties. And it is worth pointing out here that we do have the support of all the adjoining property owners as well through their submitted APAs. So yeah, from my perspective, this proposal does fit the landform very well in terms of it's a logical division of land to acknowledge essentially what's already existing on the ground, with the boundary following an existing fence line and access track. And you would have seen that we provided some specialist input from a landscaping perspective, or landscape perspective, sorry, and also from the point of view of the economics or the productive land use potential, all in support of this division of the land. Yeah, the Lot 2 area, as you can tell, is that Charcoal Gully portion is quite, it's elongated, but it's also bisected by that natural channel flow path, and also obviously the Westmoreland waterways, which just makes it certainly not simple or productive to develop in any sort of typical horticulture, viticulture type setup. So in terms of, making allowance for headland space and all of that sort of thing, it's just not really achievable. So, and then obviously you sort of look at what you can do with it. Being limited like that, it really is just a light stock grazing type of unit. Obviously a little bit more difficult to manage, I suppose, given that it is broken up into these different areas and you have to keep stock clear of watercourses and that sort of thing. So it's quite attractive, therefore, as a rural lifestyle type block that can have those little pockets, little areas, with say, a couple of horses maybe attached to it, rather than trying to really get any real financial return off the block. Yeah, so that's sort of the drive for this proposal and why we've ended up where we have. The current landowners, Roy Murdoch here and Joyce, they've lived on the property for many years and run their own horses over it. You'll see they've got the arena there and have had it set up as a business unit, I suppose you'd say. But yeah, they've just realised that it's becoming a little bit too much to manage. The whole property is one, particularly that Lot 2 Charcoal Gully portion, which isn't really of any use to them personally anymore, but they do want to stay living on the property. So yeah, the subdivision's sort of responding, or proposed subdivision is a response to that and where they're at present, and obviously providing an opportunity for James and Nina to move in there and continue essentially the existing land use, just with an additional residential activity play as well. So that's probably all immediately from me, but yeah, certainly happy to answer questions. I don't know whether I'll open the floor just in case there's anything that any of you want to add, but I'm sure you'll have questions anyway. So
yeah, thank you, Mr. Hills. And if there is anything that the applicant or the owner do want to add, then please just fire ahead. And if you don't, then I've got a reasonably simple question, and it's just around, for me, the Westmoreland race. Just looking at the scheme plan, the 417 certificate that the ORC have issued, and that's in respect of WR 1378, isn't it?
1378. Just dig that out myself. Give me 2 seconds. Because the one that we received as a response, or in response from ORC in the last week or so, was actually related to 417 that brings the water to the site from Dewey's Creek, and then down through the site itself. So instruments.
I just was using the information that came through from the ORC with the 417 certificate and just trying to work out. Sorry, that they say is a map of 3231B, and I always get confused over which is which. I'm just trying to put a perspective. I go back to the application document, the scheme plan, and the blue lines. I guess I want to just clarify which races are which for me, please. That would be helpful.
Yes, no problem. So the 3231B relates to WR 1378. So you're correct. Yep. The WR 1097 is actually the Westmoreland, which is shown on. So that plan that we did up with the titled existing watercourses, and that refers or relates the section 417 references to the easement instruments. So yes, you've got WR 1378, which is related to easement instrument 113 44524.1. It does get very confusing because the documents don't actually always make it, or very rarely make it clear what they actually relate to, the easement instruments and the 417 certificates. So.
Yeah, it's all right. It's probably not something I need to go into any further detail with. It was more just trying to get my head around the lines on the maps, and I was trying to make sure that water wasn't going uphill, but it doesn't really matter. So no, I don't need that information to carry on with any of my deliberation side of things. So Martin or Stephen, any questions?
Nothing from me. I had the same issues trying to work out where everything was going. It looked like it was flowing uphill.
It's probably frustrating me more because I should know where it goes. It's only just a couple of k's up the road, for goodness sake. I still look and get confused, so that's all right. Martin, you're all good?
All good.
Cool. Ms. Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you. Nothing really to add. I stand by my report and the proposed conditions, except I'd just like to make a slight amendment to proposed condition 5, which relates to the Esplanade strip for Lowburn. And I just want to introduce that's a 5 metre Esplanade strip. When I went back and reviewed everything, I sort of realised that I hadn't clarified exactly how wide that Esplanade strip was to be. So, and that 5 metres is consistent with what's proposed in the application and with the existing Esplanade strip that runs through past Lowburn. So that's the only change I have.
Very good. Thank you. I'm not going to ask you questions about Esplanade strips and their usefulness.
Please don't.
Otherwise, my views might become known otherwise.
I think possibly the only other thing that I would mention is that there were some concerns raised in the submission regarding the filling in of the diverted water course, and obviously that doesn't form part of this application, but the applicant has obviously attempted to get some clarification from ORC, but that perhaps was not as helpful as it would have been. So in this regard, I'm not inclined to treat it as a watercourse and just refer to the watercourse as Charcoal Creek, the natural flow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right. Martin, Stephen, nothing that Ms. Lindsay has said that gives you rise to any more questions. Mr. Hills, for you and your team, any closing remarks, any responses, anything else we need to know?
I don't think so. I won't speak for everybody though. Anything you want to add, Roy? Or
yes, I'd like to say that we've had that land for probably 25 years. Well, we had 48 hectares altogether. It's been broken up into several blocks, but the area that we have now that we propose, that will be the one of the subdivision. We trained horses. I was the only trainer in the South Island for films for many years. We brought people, film stars, etc., to Cromwell for many years and trained them there. We trained horses for films. We done 400 horses for one thing. We done the Willow film, 650 horses. We done the Eco Challenge, 450 horses. We've had all them horses and done these films and ads for years. We're both now getting past that, but we still train dressage people. Now, we don't need all this land for dressage horses. That's why we've cut it up. We've got a lucerne block that grazes, that's enough feed for us. We've got the stables, everything is complete. We've got the little paddocks for the horses that we train. And we've sort of downgraded to this. The block that we propose subdividing off is suitable for horses. That's about all. When we were grazing lots of horses and cattle and sheep and stuff for films, We could use this, put them out there for a couple of weeks, but that's all we used it for. We've got no use for it now. And when James and Nina come along and they've got their family is interested in horses, and that's what they've used this land for. It suited us fine to let them have it, because that is the reason we don't want it. We now don't do films, advertising, that sort of thing. We train horses 1, 2, 3 at a time. And what we propose now is sufficient for our use. And as we're getting older, we don't want to leave. We don't want to go back to Queenstown. We don't want to go anywhere else. And we've got a nice little valley here, nice little spot here. We propose to stay there till we cut it out. So that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Thank you, Roy. Appreciate that. Right. Anything else? No. Righto. All good. The formal part then, the decision of the hearings panel is reserved. The formal decision will be in writing and available within the statutory period of 15 working days. In the event that the release of the decision is delayed, the applicant will be advised of the delay. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate a good application, succinct presentations this morning, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Sam.
Rightio, people. Our next hearing, Nicole, is scheduled for 1 o'clock, isn't it?
Let me just confirm. You are correct. Did you want to just stop recording this?